Hey guys, welcome back to INC Live and welcome to my recap of UFC Fight Night Overeem versus Volkov. Managed to get myself a new webcam, new microphone, managed to do my fingering over the past 2 weeks. Long story about that. With that being said, let's get to the fights. And I think the first place we need to start is in our main event where Alistair Overeem took on Alexander Volkov. Two top 10 heavyweights going at it with an outside chance of the winner fighting the winner of Stipe Miocic versus Francis Ngannou for the belt. Now, I ran a poll on the main INC channel where I asked people to pick their winners for this one. And Alistair Overeem was given a 70-30 edge with most of the subscribers, which I was a little bit surprised by because Volkov entered this fight as the bookmaker's favourite, so I don't know if people were maybe swayed by the bigger name or the idea of Overeem having like one last fairy tale run and getting himself the belt, retiring, running off into the sunset with his head held high. I personally backed Volkov for this one. I thought that he would be much more dominant on the feet and that he had the ground game and the defensive skills to neutralise Overeem's takedowns, which has been one of his go-tos in recent weeks. That being said, I didn't expect Volkov to be as dominant as what he was. He kept Overeem on the edge of his punches. He deterred any threat of a takedown, which, as mentioned before, Overeem's been very successful with. Overeem landed a couple of overhands, which caught Volkov in that first round, but outside of that, I wouldn't say there was anything that alarmed Volkov. It was quite a comfortable performance, which, as somebody who expected the fight to be maybe a bit more competitive, I was disappointed by. It was an underwhelming main event from that regard, as good as a performance it was from Volkov. Overeem's recently been utilising this rope-a-dope strategy. We saw that especially when he fought Augusto Sakai. He keeps up this high guard, he lets people tee off on him, try and work the body a bit, and eventually tire them. Now that worked really well against Sakai, who's maybe not the most technical striker. But as we've seen before, Volkov has a lot of pop on his punches. He knows exactly what he's doing, and especially now he's beefed up a lot. Compare Volkov, say, when he fought Derek Lewis to, say, the Walt Harris fight. You can tell that he's a lot thicker than he was. He's put on a lot of muscle. And now those shots, which Volkov was always a good striker, but he was never a power puncher. Now he's got that power. And in my opinion, Volkov's going to cause a lot of people in that division a lot of problems. Whether I see him beating the Stipes, the Francises, the Kurt Splades of the world, I'm not entirely sure. He pretty much beat Derek Lewis, who's like a top 5 staple, so we know he's good. And hopefully this is a performance to make people sit up and say Alexander Volkov is a heavyweight that's worth watching, because he's only 32 as well. Heavyweight's the old man division. You got this 32-year-old guy who's massive for the weight class, knows how to use his reach. He's going to cause people a lot of problems. He's essentially, and I know Stefan Struve gets a lot of grief, but he's what Stefan Struve should have been. And I'm glad to see him giving this highlight reel performance, which hopefully will make people sit up. He's not the main story though. The main story is Alistair Overeem. Now, Overeem's spoken recently about wanting to call it a day. He seems content with winding down his career. None of us will be disappointed if he does so after this. He's one of the legends of the sport. He's going to be in the UFC Hall of Fame based on what he did in Pride, Strikeforce, Dream. His UFC run was also very successful. Fought for the title, dropped Stipe. You've got to remember that. I don't think anybody's going to have any sort of disappointment if Overeem decides, hey, 41 years old, I don't want to take any more damage, I'm calling it a day. Because he's a legend of the sport. Disappointing result for him, but thank you for everything, Alistair, because I do think this is the last time we'll see him in the octagon. Volkov's knockout, though, isn't the one that people are talking about, which brings us on to the co-main, Corey Sandhagen versus Frankie Edgar. Now, when this fight got booked, I was very worried for Frankie. Sandhagen has great striking, great distance management, and I thought that reach advantage to something like 8 inches, that would be too much for Frankie to overcome. Yes, Frankie had the threat of takedowns. We know Sandhagen isn't really good at stopping the takedowns from happening. But I didn't expect that. Flying knee, 30 seconds into the first round. And that's Sandhagen's second highlight reel knockout in as many fights. He got that spinning kick against Marlon Moraes, which really got overlooked when you look at the great knockouts of 2020. Obviously, Joaquin Buckley was the one that immediately came to mind. But Sandhagen's kick against Moraes was fantastic. And this is going to be in the reckoning as well when it comes to the end of the year poll. People just don't do that to Frankie Edgar. Frankie's always been praised in the past for his durability, his recovery skills, You look at his matches against Gray Maynard, he took some massive shots in the second and third fight, and he still came back to draw the second fight and then win the third fight. So we know he can take a punch and he can come back from it. Even when he's been stopped recently, like against Brian Ortega or Korean Zombie, it was just accumulation of strikes, which eventually proved too much. You don't one-shot stop Frankie Edgar until that point. And you could see from the way that Frankie went down, he was full on out. That was like Ben Askren. You know when Askren stiffened up and just flopped to the ground? That's what happened to Frankie Edgar at that moment. And you just don't do that to him, even at 39 years old. Now, Corey Stuck took a massive hit after the Aljamain loss. Now, I was one of the people who was on the Sandhagen hype train, so I had to stay quiet for a couple of weeks after UFC 250. He has bounced back big time after that. And regardless of who wins between Aljo and Piotr Jan, he should fight the winner. And I know a lot of people will say, well, Aljo finished him really early on. Is there going to be an appetite for that rematch? I think he's shown that there is one. Anybody can scramble, and he made a mistake in the Aljo fight. He's the first to admit that. I think if that fight goes on a lot longer, we're going to get a much more competitive fight. And I think he can cause Piotr Jan a lot of problems. I think he has a striking style, which could trouble someone like Piotr Jan in the same way that Jimmy Rivera did, staying on the outside, picking and choosing his shots. My one fear, though, is the UFC don't see the bantamweight sort of new generation in the high regard the fans do. I mean, it's not at the flyweight levels where people immediately dismiss it and the UFC wanted to get shot of it. But you look at guys like the Corey Sandhagens of the world and the Piotr Jans, the Aljamain Sterlings. You've got some really exciting, top quality fighters in that division. My fear is the UFC don't see them as marketable enough. And given the choice between Corey Sandhagen or, say, a TJ Dillashaw, a Cody Garbrandt, or trying to get Henry Cejudo back, if there's a chance between those four fights, I think Sandhagen's bottom of the pile. And I think that's a real shame. I think they're going to go for the bigger name to try and get the more marketable fights, rather than the guy who, in my opinion, 100% deserves the Aljo Piotr Jan winner. You've got something special in that bantamweight division. I hope the UFC don't waste it. In terms of the rest of the card, I have to give a lot of praise to Johnson versus Guida. I think sometimes people see a lot of these old guy fights and they just immediately dismiss them. Honestly, for what this fight was, which is just two veterans trying to get themselves a little extra money, trying to extend their career a little bit further, it wasn't that bad. Now, Bellator gets a lot of grief when they put on their old guy fights, but in my opinion, it's better to be doing these kind of fights than feeding them to prospects. Like when you're say like Brian Kelleher and you're beating like Shot Henan Barao, you don't really gain all that much from it. So put the veterans against one another like they did here, and it was a fun enough fight. It was fought at a high pace. I thought it played out the way that I expected it to, Guida's pressure being too much for Michael Johnson. Those issues of Michael Johnson, which we've seen throughout his career, it once again showed up. The power's there, the aggression's there. He caused Guida some issues with those big shots early in the first round, but once Guida tagged him, and I was surprised by how much crack that Guida had on his punches, because he's always been known for being a bit pillow-fisted. Once that happened, Johnson just seemed to shell up and lose all of his confidence again, and there must be an issue when it comes to psychology when it comes to Michael Johnson, because we've seen what he can do to Tony Ferguson, Edson Barboza, knocking out Dustin Poirier in the first round. He's got the skills, he's got the qualities to be successful. He just can't seem to put it together, especially not now when he's 36, 37 years old. I've teased the idea of actually doing a retrospective on Michael Johnson because I can't think of another fighter with such extreme highs and extreme lows as what he does. There's such a yin and yang fighter, and I think it's a real shame, and I think maybe he should consider calling it a day, being 36, being on a losing streak. There are flashes of the old MJ there, but just not enough these days. Beneil Dariush and Diego Ferreira, a lot of people thought this one was going to be a fight of the night contender. It proved to be. Great scrambles in the first round. Diego came on strong late. There was no way that was 29-28 though. So Joan Villel, who was the judge who gave that for Diego Ferreira, I think he needs to have a good hard look in the mirror. Because personally, I thought it was an easy 29-28 for Beneil. And this is 6 wins in a row for Beneil. A lot of people wrote him off after the Alex Hernandez loss. And that was a guy who came in on short notice. Beneil wasn't prepared for him. He just bum rushed him and caught him out in the first minute of that fight. And Hernandez deserved all the praise that he got for that fight, but Beneil was written off immediately. I mean, he was put on the prelims of like Asian fight nights, fighting guys well below his level. He was never that bad, and he slowly had to work his way back up, and now he's going to be back in the top 10, 6 wins in a row. Likeable guy as well, so I'm really happy that Beneil's finally getting that respect that, in my opinion, he's deserved. So, because I stayed on that Beneil train after what happened against Hernandez, and it's finally coming to fruition, so I'm quite happy about that. It's a testimony as well to how good this division is, because Beneil and Diego Ferreira have, 5-fight winning streaks, 6-fight winning streaks, and they were the 10th and the 13th ranked contenders at lightweight. In some divisions, you've got to win one fight to get a title shot, or if you're Holly Holm, you can lose 2 and still get a title shot. That being said, I think we're going to be hitting Beneil's ceiling soon. I think his grappling's fantastic. I think his striking's made considerable improvements, but he's just a bit too hittable to handle those top guys. I think if you put him against RDA, Paul Felder, he's got a chance. But if you put him against someone like a Justin Gaethje or a Conor McGregor or a Dustin Poirier, someone of that sort of ilk, it's not going to end well for Beneil. So I think we're starting to hit his ceiling, but him even reaching this point after everything he's been through, like the comeback wins and having to rebuild his stock after the Hernandez loss, deserves a lot of praise. If there was one disappointment of the night, it was Manel Kape. I have a lot of friends who were Ryzen diehards, so they hyped this guy to the hill. So I was curious. They told me about Yuri Prochazka as well, so very similar to that. I was curious to see how he did. With Yuri, you've got a guy who he pretty much fought against Volkan the way he normally does in Ryzen. It's a very lopsided style, hands down, and manages to have that big knockout power. With Kape is a lot more aggressive when he fights in Ryzen, yet this time around we saw him staying on the outside. He picked and chooses his shots well. He was very accurate, so I think 70-80% strike accuracy. But for whatever reason, he just didn't shoot enough as much as what he should. I don't know if he was maybe overawed by the occasion, whether he was scared of Pantoja's takedowns, but we just didn't see the aggression from Manel that what we ideally should have done. And that's really what won Pantoja this fight. When Manel did push forward, especially later on in the fight, we saw a lot of that aggression. We saw that striking ability, and I still think he's going to be a good addition to a flyweight division that doesn't really have those big trash talkers, those knockout artists in the way that we maybe do. So I still like Manel. I'm still going to keep an eye on him, and I hope that he could easily beat, say, a Max Schnell or a Kai Kara France in that division, because he is a very talented striker. That wasn't one of his highlights, and I hope that people don't write him off because of that. With that being said, though, I thoroughly enjoyed the card. I personally think it was a stronger undercard than what we're getting for UFC 258. So I think the UFC have made themselves a little bit of a mistake in this one. I would have saved some of the higher profile fights, the Sandhagen versus Edgars, and moved them onto 258 to bolster that one. 258 is going to be the next card that we're covering now when we do the preview show. I'm going to be having John Martian back for that one, which I'm really looking forward to. This has been my recap of UFC Fight Night Overeem versus Volkov. Hope you've enjoyed it. Any sort of feedback regarding the video, regarding the technical abilities, my own broadcasting style, would be greatly appreciated. This is something that I'm going to try to do and get a lot better. With that being said, my name's been Karl Bainbridge. I hope you enjoyed the fights, and stay tuned for the UFC 258 preview show that's coming up in just a few hours' time.